Television sets had officially shifted from black and white to technicolour, but for the most part Arsenal still suffered in monochrome. Gone was Herbert Chapman and the glory days of what was termed the Bank of England club, and Arsenal had become also-rans. They had their days in the sun, the double of 71, a couple of domestic cup finals and an appearance in the Cup Winners' Cup final. None of it, however, was sustained. Until George Graham. This is the story of his Arsenal team of 1989, of 1991, of the Cup double and of Europe. This is a modern Arsenal. Arsenal would win league titles again after the death of Herbert Chapman and after the Second World War, firstly in 1948 and 1953. Sandwiched in between were the FA Cup finals of 1950 and 52 to varying degrees of success, beating Liverpool in the first final and losing to Newcastle in the latter game. The Gunners, however, would miss fire just as the Stan Cullis-led Wolverhampton Wanderers and the Matt Busby-endorsed Manchester United fired on all cylinders, and the boundaries of the game were expanded to continental competitions such as the European Cup, Fairs Cup and Cup Winners' Cup. 1966, however, was a great year for English football. Bertie Mee was made Arsenal manager, and he began to create the beginnings of a first-grade Arsenal team that could creep out from underneath the crushing shadow of Herbert Chapman. That year, talent such as Pat Rice and Sammy Nelson led the club to winning the FA Youth Cup, 12 months on from defeat in the same competition's final against Everton. Rice would join captain Frank McClintock in the centre of defence, whilst Bob Wilson kept goal and the likes of John Radford, Charlie George, Ray Kennedy and George Graham were fielded further forward. They'd return to the conversation, appearing in successive League Cup finals once their participation was made mandatory, as well as featuring in a first final on the continent. The astute Leeds under Don Revie would claim the 1968 League Cup final before the extra-time shock of Swindon Town disarmed the Gunners 12 months later. A year beyond that, it appeared as though the Fairs Cup final against Anderlecht would follow a similar route, when the Belgians were victorious 3-1 in Brussels. Thankfully, however, Ray Kennedy brought back a glimmer of hope from the first leg, and the second leg strikes from Eddie Kelly, John Radford and John Samuels saw to the overturning of the deficit. Arsenal had their first piece of European silverware. Supplemented by the coaching brilliance of Don Howe, Bertie Mee's Arsenal were on the precipice of something special when the 1970-71 season turned up. An inauspicious start gave way for the motoring of an unstoppable machine as Arsenal pieced together 2 long unbeaten runs in the league either side of Christmas to hold off the great Leeds United by a single point. That they did so with a late 1-0 win at White Hart Lane thanks to a Ray Kennedy goal on the final day made the success all the more sweeter. Defensively brilliant, only Liverpool could match their clean sheet numbers in the league, and that is the opposition Arsenal received in the FA Cup final of the same year. Liverpool stood between Arsenal and history making. Only Tottenham's vintage of 1961 had been able to complete the league and cup double in the 20th century, and Arsenal craved to match their North London rivals. A match played almost wholly within the confines of the extra time period. George Graham levelled the tie up before the halfway point before Charlie George snatched the winning goal on 111 minutes. Mee departed in 1976 and Arsenal wouldn't win another slice of silverware, but came as close as you could possibly get. In both 1972 and 73, the prospect of more doubles appeared on the horizon. However, Leeds stopped them in the 1972 FA Cup final, and a plucky lower league Sunderland thwarted them from a rematch in the same game 12 months later. Meanwhile, they finished just off the pace in a manic league season in 72, finishing 5th but only 6 points back on champions Derby. That before missing out on another league title in 1973 by just 3 points from Bill Shankly's Liverpool. That was the watershed for darker times to return to Arsenal. The spine of the team all departed in successive years between 1972 and 76. When George Graham left for Manchester United, Frank McClintock was bizarrely sold to QPR the following year, Bob Wilson retired 12 months later, Charlie George was surrendered to Derby in 75, before John Radford left for West Ham. Unable to hide behind the coaching acumen of Don Howe, with marquee transfer Alan Ball flopping and only the goals of Brian Kidd staving off relegation, it was clear another era at Highbury was over. The 1970s, however, would conclude with an often forgotten cup team of Irish connection. Terry Neal would manage the side up to 1983, a team that featured an almost all-Irish backline thanks to the acquisitions of Pat Jennings in goal and David O'Leary at centre-half, joining Pat Rice, promoted to captain, and Sammy Nelson. Liam Brady had become one of the club's most important players, whilst Frank Stapleton knocked in the goals, aided by Alan Sunderland and Malcolm McDonald. Rising to the confines of the top half, the Gunners' first big test came in the 1978 FA Cup final against Bobby Robson's Ipswich Town. Unfortunately, the Tractor Boys had ploughed a greater course and were on their way to glory in Europe, as well as a treble bid in the 1980s. Arsenal, however, would hold their own, despite the loss to Ipswich, and returned to the FA Cup final in each of the next 2 seasons, as well as featuring in a European final over their own. In an incredible 3 minutes, the 1979 FA Cup final came alive when Manchester United's Gordon McQueen and Sammy McIlroy cancelled Arsenal's 2 goals out before Alan Sunderland struck before the game was out. The following year's showpiece event was far less dramatic and far less successful for Neil and his Arsenal Chargers. Like Sunderland and Southampton in the decade before them, lower league West Ham won the cup against esteemed opposition, as Trevor Brooking scored the early winner. 4 days later, however, Arsenal had another shot at glory when they travelled to Brussels, scene of their Fairs Cup win a decade prior, to meet Valencia. After 120 goalless minutes, the penalty would be paid by both Brady and Graham Rix, as Arsenal lost from 12 yards. The 1980s looked all set to be an afterthought. Arsenal continually placed within the top half of the league, but never threatened the pace. Whilst English clubs were banned from Europe midway through the decade, Arsenal's failings in the earlier stages of the UEFA Cup to teams like Genk and Spartak Moscow didn't suggest they'd be missed anyway. Don Howe couldn't restore his genius in a return as manager, and in the summer of 1986, Arsenal were left recruiting a new manager once again. Arsenal hadn't won a trophy in 7 years. They were practically and also ran in a world dominated by Merseyside powers up north. The stalwarts of yesteryear in Frank Stapleton, Pat Rice and Liam Brady were long gone, whilst the talismanic figure of Charlie Nicholas had grown ineffectual at best. There were a band of young players coming through the system, notably David Rocastle and Tony Adams, as well as Michael Thomas, Paul Merson and Perry Groves. They needed a strong character to bring them up into their peak as footballers. Enter George Graham. When he departed Arsenal in the summer of 72, so too did he depart the peak of his football career. His time in England petered out with quick-fire spells at Old Trafford, Fratton Park and Sellers Park, before retiring in the sun of California, aged only 33. Turning out just 12 times for Scotland, he immediately plunged himself into youth coaching. First at former club Crystal Palace and then at Queen's Park Rangers in 1980. In the past few years, it had been QPR, not Arsenal, who had come closest to bringing the First Division trophy back to the capital. Graham's first senior post would be in London, but not at QPR, instead at Millwall, who he found bottom of the 3rd Division. After surviving by the skin of their teeth on the final day of the 1982-83 season, thanks to a win away at Chesterfield, Millwall was set on a path to the very top by the Scotsman. First promotion under Graham to the 2nd tier in 1985, before the ascension to the top flight by 1987, by which point George Graham had already got his feet under the table at Arsenal and had them winning silverware. Before George Graham, there was supposed to be Terry Venables, there was supposed to be Bobby Robson, and Vice Chairman David Dean even suggested the Aberdeen manager, Alex Ferguson. The latter wasn't taken seriously. Robson was busy taking charge of England after a promising World Cup campaign in Mexico, and Venables had just coached in a European Cup final with Barcelona. So Arsenal went further down their list as the fans got more and more disorientated after the sacking of club favourite Don Howe. Even more so when his successor got announced, formerly of 2nd Division Millwall, George Graham. Not even the fact that he had been an integral part of the double winning side of 71 could save him. George Graham gave everybody at the club 6 weeks to prove their worth. Once that time period was over, the moves began to be made. Out went the expensive deadwood of Stuart Robson, Tommy Caton, Tony Woodcock and Paul Mariner, whilst Martin Keown was famously sold to Aston Villa after the haggling over £50 a week in wages. Then the experience of Kenny Sampson, Viv Anderson and Charlie Nicholas were all bombed out into the reserves in favour of youth and vibrance that had been Graham's calling card so far as a coach. He would bring Theo Foley with him from Millwall as assistant and even extended his useful transfer policy to his back room when Gary Lewin began a storied career at Highbury when he was hired as a physio straight out of university. Alan Smith was acquired from Leicester City to cover for the departures up front, and Tony Adams was made club captain despite his age of just 21. George Graham would have a stack of regional newspapers delivered to his desk weekly, which formed the basis of his scouting for cheap, young, hungry lower league talent, of which Perry Groves was the first for his tenacity, whilst Everton's Kevin Richardson brought some much needed experience. The first game of the George Graham tenure was a 1-0 win over Manchester United at home. Outside of that, the start was somewhat of a baptism of fire. Arsenal were defeated 3 times early on and failed to score in 4 successive matches in September. Solace could be found through League Cup progression against Huddersfield Town, Manchester City and Charlton Athletic before league fortune was turned around. By which point Arsenal had found their feet, were routinely keeping clean sheets, found the net with more regularity and strung together an unbeaten run in the league that took in all of October, November and December, as well as the majority of January 1987. The following month confirmed the turning point. Arsenal had gone down to Tottenham at home in the first leg of a League Cup semi-final and quickly found themselves 2 down on aggregate midway through the second half. The story goes that after hearing a tannoy announcement about how Spurs fans could pick up their Wembley tickets, Arsenal got fired up. Goals from the returning Viv Anderson and the youthful Niall Quinn forced a replay. In that second game at White Hart Lane, a late turnaround thanks to Ian Allinson and David Rocastle booked Arsenal's place in the final. Waiting for them would be Liverpool. They were a team that had dominated Wembley finals in the 80s, and after Ian Rush scored, Liverpool was safe in the knowledge that they hadn't lost when the Welshman had found the net. Until April the 5th, 1987, in that very League Cup final. In what was amongst his final flurries as an Arsenal player, Charlie Nicholas scored a brace to bring home the League Cup and a first trophy for 8 years. Built on the foundations of a successful first season, George Graham acquired 2 of the famous backline in one swoop, Lee Dixon from Stoke City and Nigel Winterburn from Wimbledon for cup prices. After a good start to the league, the season quickly became encapsulated by another run to the League Cup final. They had done the hard work by beating a great Everton side over 2 legs and had Luton Town in front of them at Wembley. Massive favourites despite sharing the first division with the Bedfordshire club, Arsenal led 2-1 in the second half in a match that had their entire season resting on it. Then they were awarded a penalty to seal the contest. Michael Thomas, the usual taker, elected not to take it, and the surprising figure of Nigel Winterburn stepped up, only to miss. Such was karma that day. Luton scored 2 in the final 8 minutes, the winner from Brian Stein in the 90th minute, claiming the famous trophy. Still smarting from the cup final defeat, George Graham completed his famous defence in the summer of '88, with the acquisition of Steve Bold before selling arguably their biggest player in Charlie Nicholas. The season didn't begin in the best light. After a mixture of results, Paul Davies faced a 9-match ban for punching an opponent in a home draw against Southampton. All the while, Tony Adams continued to be vilified for his shoddy performances at Euro 88 with England, routinely labelled a donkey by the wider public. His new centre-back partner hardly started in fine fashion either, as Steve Bold allowed John Fashanu to put Wimbledon in front at Plough Lane early on in the opening day. The glimmer of hope was the 5 goals Arsenal stuck beyond them in response. Their pre-season odds of 16-1 to win the league were lengthening though by the second. Then a derby win at White Hart Lane, a 4-1 triumph at Forest, a home win over Manchester United and a draw at home to Liverpool before Christmas became the hallmark of a successful first half of the season. By the time they defeated Charlton Athletic away from home on Boxing Day, they commanded top spot. The following month, the Gunners were applauded off by Everton after a 3-1 win at Goodison Park, who were without a title challenge, rare at the time. This was not only because Arsenal represented the best chance at stopping Liverpool, but also because they had put in one of their best performances of the season. Liverpool would become their eventual title challengers. They had started to circle the wagons after Christmas, and despite dropping points against QPR controversially, Coventry, Millwall, Forest, Charlton and Man United, Arsenal was still in pole position when tragedy struck. Arsenal were edging one match closer to an elusive First League title in 18 years with a 1-0 win over Newcastle when the fateful FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest that took 97 lives at Hillsborough was taking place. Football, quite rightly, was put on the back burner. Returning 2 weeks later, it resumed and Arsenal picked off where they left off, putting 5 past Norwich and squeezing another 3 points out of a tricky trip to Ayresome Park and Middlesbrough. Home ties with Derby County and Wimbledon stood between Arsenal and the title before what looked like a guard of honour in the final match of the season at Anfield. Somehow Liverpool summoned up enough strength to keep the heat on Arsenal in the league and win the FA Cup against Everton in a solemn affair at Wembley. Meanwhile, Arsenal missed a chance to win the league beforehand. First came a defeat against Derby thanks to the winner from a Liverpool supporting Dean Saunders, then a draw against Wimbledon, who levelled the match up not once but twice, which served to hand the title on a platter to Liverpool. Liverpool had one more game prior to the Friday night conclusion against Arsenal at Anfield. They met West Ham at home in a contest where they could ratchet up the goal difference and make it impossible for Arsenal to win the league. John Aldridge, Ray Horton, Ian Rush, John Barnes and Ray Horton again all scored in a 5-1 victory. A 4-goal triumph left the tiniest of glimmers of hope for Arsenal. The final match was a playoff in all but name on May the 26th, 1989, but Arsenal fans travelled north without much hope. They needed a 2-goal win to snatch the league on goals scored. Liverpool hadn't lost at home in the league since December. They hadn't conceded twice at home in the league or failed to score at home in the league since October. They hadn't lost by 2 goals in the league at home since February 1986, when Everton won 2-0. In fact, nobody had come from outside Liverpool and secured a 2-0 win at Anfield in the league since Sheffield Wednesday did so in September 1984. In the build-up to the game, former Liverpool player and future Liverpool manager Graham Souness put his name to an interview headlined Men Against Boys, where he predicted a comfortable Liverpool win. That was enough for an Arsenal team talk on its own. Arsenal were at 16-1 odds to win 2-0. 37 matches had passed, the odds had fluctuated, but Arsenal found themselves at the exact same position as they had done when they started the campaign. 7 weeks prior to the big day, George Graham had experimented with a back 5 in a 1-1 draw at Old Trafford. The time was now to get that back out of the back pocket. Instead of herring towards Liverpool like many expected, George Graham set Arsenal up to draw the first half 0-0 and then slowly grow into the second half. Instead of staying over on Merseyside, they went up that afternoon and were booked to return to the capital, win, lose or draw, that very Friday evening. The ultimate smash and grab. Liverpool were stuck in the type of two minds understandable from a team who could be victorious after a one-goal defeat, whilst Arsenal too were tentative only by design. They were at full strength with the exception of Michael Thomas. The midfielder ultimately made the squad after tweaking his knee ligament and playing through the pain, but physio Gary Lewin advised the manager he'd be fit to start but not to finish. It was the first time a watching audience from their living room would see a league title decided, and after 45 minutes the scores were deadlocked. From the outside, the title was slipping away from Arsenal as Steve Bold went the closest from a header which was blocked on the line by Steve Nicol. On the inside though, a draw at half-time was mission accomplished from George Graham's perspective. Arsenal were even bolstered by Ian Rush coming off injured, even if he was handily replaced by Peter Beardsley. Ahead of the second half, Graham gave Dixon and Winterburn a touch more adventure on the flanks. And it was Winterburn who provided the cross for the goal on 52 minutes, the fuse lit in front of the Anfield Road end. Liverpool players surrounded the referee. There was no foul, no offside, but it was an indirect free kick, and there was some debate over whether Alan Smith actually had got a touch on the ball. The referee excruciatingly had to go over to the assistant to conclude that Smith did in fact get a touch and the goal should be allowed. As Liverpool spurned chances, Michael Thomas stood with the net gaping, only to come out of the endeavour unsuccessful, with Grobbelaar winning out. With 15 minutes left, Liverpool needed to stay solid, Arsenal needed another goal. The entire season had boiled down to this. Steve McMahon had given the signal for all to see on the television. There was 1 minute left. Television producers, unsure whether a running clock would work on screen, decided to broadcast the time live, which was a first, at least for English football. Lee Dixon was told the match was over by the referee after one final play, as goalkeeper Andreas Limpar calmly threw him the ball as if it was a nondescript moment in a nondescript match. Instead of a panicked lump forward, Dixon carefully played the ball through the midfield, finding Alan Smith with a measured pass, who laid the ball on for Michael Thomas. After a couple of ricochets fell kindly for Arsenal, it was all up for grabs. Thomas sauntered past Steve Nicol in a laid-back manner that only he could, and clipped the ball goalwards. This time Grobbelaar couldn't thwart it. The ball was in, and after the most exhausting season, the title was won in the final minute. It never did get much better than that. They might have been in more imperious form, as one league defeat across the 1990-91 season perfectly describes. They might have won more trophies, as a double victory in the Wembley Cup finals across the spring of '93 attest to. And George Graham might have delivered the club its second European trophy in the Cup Winners' Cup, but it all paled into insignificance with the evening of Anfield '89. Arsenal were the second Invincibles, and we'll certainly cover that story tomorrow. But the second unbeaten season in English football should not have been in the 2003-04 campaign, but in George Graham's second title-winning season in 1991. They lost just one match that season, away to Chelsea in February, a game in which they were missing Tony Adams due to a stretch in prison for drink driving. The club had lost its sparkle and lent a little too much on their immovable defensive prowess to deliver a dull brand of football as the advent of the Premier League reared into view. A Premier League that might not have existed with the might of such a televisual backing had Anfield '89 not happened. Arsenal fans thought they had seen a modern Arsenal, but they hadn't, not really anyway. Yes, George Graham was the one to have ended a generation in the wilderness in terms of winning a league title. And yes, George Graham was the one to finally put the Gunners on the map in terms of winning silverware in Europe. But his football was not the type of football that was going to keep Arsenal at the forefront of a burgeoning Premier League and well into the 21st century. In the end, his reign ended in ignominy. He was caught allegedly accepting a bung as part of a transfer deal, and that was him. Kaput, finished. Good night Vienna, or Anfield, or Copenhagen, where the Cup Winners' Cup was won. Bruce Rioch was the bridge between two distinct eras at Highbury, from the haze of George Graham returning the good times to North London, and to the manager who helped move the club out of the old stadium and into a bright future known as the 21st century. Gone would be the stoicism, the boredom, the 1-0 to the Arsenal, and in its place the continent would pitch up in the little red corner of North London. In its place, excitement, joie de vivre, va va voom. But that is a story for another day, namely tomorrow.